In this video, we're going to be looking at finding margins of error for surveys. So for a survey, you need to make your sample size large enough so that it accurately represents the population. And we saw that in action in the previous examples. Because what we see is that as the sample size increases, the margin of error decreases. So you may say, what is the margin of error? Well, the margin of error is a limit on how much the responses of the sample are different from those of the population. So for example, we can say if 40% of the people in a poll favor a new tax law and the margin of error is plus or minus 4%, then it's likely that between 36% and 44% of the entire population favor a new tax law. So you get 40%, you have a margin of error of plus or minus 4%. So you're saying you're pretty sure that the actual percentage is going to be either 4% less than 40, which is 36%, or 4% more than 40, which is 44%. And so we can actually find this margin of error with this formula. So when a random sample size of size n is taken from a large population, the margin of error is approximated by plus or minus 1 over the square root of n. And if the percent of the sample responding a certain way is p, written as a decimal, then the percent of the population who would respond the same way is likely between p minus 1 over square root of n and p plus 1 over square root of n. So first, let's go ahead and practice finding the margin of error. So we're going to find the margin of error for a survey that has a given sample size, and we're going to round the answer to the nearest tenth of a percent. So here I have a sample size of 270, and so I know that the margin of error is going to be 1 over the square root of 270. And for that, you can go to desmos.com/calculator and type that in. So I'm going to do 1 divided by square root 270, and I get this number. And I want to first round to 3 decimal places, and then I'm going to change this to a percent. So if I round this to 3 decimal places, I get 0.061. And I know I have this plus or minus that's in front from my formula. And changing that to a percent, that means it's going to be approximately plus or minus 6.1%. Let's look at another one. Now we'll do for 6,500. So I have 1 over the square root of 6,500, and rounding that to 3 decimal places, I get that this is approximately plus or minus 0.012. So that means that my margin of error is plus or minus 1.2%. So you'll notice that as my sample size increased, 6,500 is much bigger than 270, my margin of error also decreased. This 1.2% is much smaller than the 6.1%. So let's go ahead and actually apply this to a real-world problem. So here it says, in a survey of 2,048 people in the U.S., 55% said that television is their main source of news. So they surveyed, out of all the people in the U.S., they surveyed 2,048. So that is my sample size. My sample size is 2048. Now I want to find the margin of error for this survey. And so I know the margin of error is just going to be plus or minus 1 over the square root of n. So this is going to be plus or minus 1 over the square root of 2048. And when you do that calculation, coming back over here, you get approximately 0.022 plus or minus. And so changing that to a percent, that means that my margin of error is going to be plus or minus 2.2%. Okay, and then the next part says to give an interval that is likely to contain the exact percent of all people who use television as their main source of news. So we want to get an interval of saying, okay, so since we just sampled 2,048 people, was it likely that the actual percentages of all people in the U.S.? And so this plus or minus 2.2% means I'm going to add 2.2 to 55 and subtract it. So I'm going to do 55% minus 2.2%, and I get 52.8%. And then I'm also going to add it. And I get 57.2%. So that means it's likely it's going to be between 52.8% and 57.2%. Okay, let's look at one more. Here it says, in a survey of 1,028 people in the U.S., 87% reported using the internet. So first, I want to find the margin of error for the survey. So I know that my N, my sample size, is how many people I surveyed. So it's going to be 1,028. So that means my margin of error is going to be 1 over the square root of 1028. So coming back over here, typing that in, I get that that's going to be approximately 0.031. So changing that to a percent, it's going to be plus or minus 3.1%. So I see my sample size here was smaller than number 3, and so my margin of error here is larger. Okay, and then lastly, I want to give an interval that is likely to contain the exact percent of all people in the U.S. who use the internet. So my margin of error just tells me how much I want to add and subtract from the percent that was found during the survey. And so the percent found in the survey was 87%. And so I want to first subtract 3.1%. And so you can do that over here in Desmos as well. 87 minus 3.1, and I get 83.9%. And then when I add 3.1%, that's going to get me 90.1%. So that means it's going to be between 83.9% and 90.1%.